Hey everyone, thanks for tuning into today's episode. Today's guest is Sam Callahan. He's the Senior Analyst at Swan Bitcoin and host of the Swan Signal podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation with him. He's super articulate and humble, and he's got his finger on the pulse when it comes to all things Bitcoin and macro. I really do appreciate his ability to break things down into very simple terms, particularly when it comes to the fiscal and monetary side of things. If you're someone who's trying to piece together what's happening in the world of economics and finance, this is an episode you're not going to want to miss. And now, without any further ado, here's my discussion with Sam.
Which one's the best crypto asset? Well, Bitcoin's the best crypto asset. Okay. What's the second best? There is no second best. There's no second best crypto asset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Why Bitcoin Show. I'm your host, Dale Warburton. It's a weekly podcast on why Bitcoin matters and what makes it completely different to all other cryptocurrencies. If you're interested in Bitcoin and you'd like to distill crypto fact from fiction, you've come to the right place.
All right, it's a beautiful day here in Brizzy, bright and early, and with me I've got Sam Callahan. Sam, welcome to the show.
Hey Dale, thanks for having me. Super excited.
Awesome. I've been looking forward to chatting to someone from Swan for a long time. Swan is probably one of my favorite Bitcoin companies, and you do a great job at representing them and have always followed kind of what you as well as what Corey does, particularly in calling out all the shitcoinery of the years. So I certainly appreciate what you guys do and keen to dive into a little bit about some of the stuff that's happening. But one of the things I enjoy about your work there, Sam, is the stuff around macro. You seem to have a really good grasp of kind of all the moving parts. And I know that's kind of a challenging job. I thought we could just dive straight into it and just have a look at currently. Lynn Alden talks about us living through this era of fiscal dominance. And it's a big theme that sort of seems to be pervasive. And I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about what that actually means. And then perhaps layer in a tweet that you put out recently relating to how so much of the COVID-related stimulus hadn't actually been spent as of yet by the states, and that we could still see a lot of this inflationary pressure continuing into the future as a result of a lot of the spending not actually having taken place in a lot of states across the US. A long-winded question, but hopefully you can jump into that.
Yeah, sure. The idea of fiscal dominance, I think it goes back to what the Federal Reserve's mandates are, which are price stability and full employment. Employment rates been at multi-decade lows for a while now, and it hasn't really risen despite them increasing interest rates. And they increase interest rates to try to combat inflation, so that makes borrowing more expensive, which kind of cools economic activity, so to speak, because there's less lending because it's more expensive. Banks are less willing to lend out. They kind of tighten their credit conditions and lending standards. I guess lending standards would be the right word to say. But in this scenario, the Fed's supposed to raise interest rates to fight inflation. But the problem is when the accumulation of government debt and the large deficit spending that we're doing, it kind of increases inflation itself, which quote unquote dominates the central bank's intentions to try to bring inflation down with the rise in interest rates. And so when the debt gets this high and interest rates get this high, that creates a lot of interest expense on the existing debt for the Treasury Department. And so that actually balloons the deficits even more. Like there's a famous chart that shows like by the end of 2024, if interest rates even stay where they are, interest expense will be over $1 trillion added to the deficit. And that's inflationary. That's just more spending that needs to happen. And that kind of puts this Fed in this hard spot because they're supposed to raise interest rates to fight inflation, but that just balloons the deficit more because of the interest expense, because the debt's so big. And so that actually creates more inflation, even though it's supposed to bring it down. But then if they cut rates to try to lessen that interest expense for the Treasury, well, that can be inflationary as well, because typically they cut rates to try to stimulate the economy out of a recession. And so right now they're talking about cutting rates, even though inflation's still above their 2% target. And many believe that it's because of this fiscal dominance. They're trying to basically lower the interest expense and reduce the size of the deficits by potentially cutting rates. But they got to be careful because, like I said, typically that stimulates the economy and that's also inflationary. And so that's what they mean by this period of like fiscal dominance. Basically, the fiscal situation is dominating the central bank's ability to conduct monetary policy appropriately. It kind of forces their hand to do something they don't want to do. They don't want to cut rates when inflation is above what they want, but because of the fiscal situation, they might be forced to, because that also is inflationary. So I hope that makes sense, but that's kind of that's what all that means. Yeah.
That's very well put. Yeah. And I think just for the layperson, that really does put things into perspective, because you've got the Fed that's sort of controlling the monetary policy, and then you've got Treasury, which is all the spending. And even though the Fed is supposed to be quote unquote independent, you'd imagine that having conversations, the Fed is fully aware of the fact that we are in this sort of fiscally dominant era where it's not as if they can do things on the monetary policy side that are going to materially impact the inflation because of the fiscal dominance. So it's such an interesting push and pull, and it really brings into question the sort of independence of the Fed. But,
yeah, definitely.
And then
that's actually like during periods of this, like where debt's this high, if you look at history, this is when Fed independence starts to get threatened, right? Because the government's kind of saying like, hold up, we got to issue a lot more debt here. You're making it really expensive for us. Like, we know that you're supposed to be independent. You kind of got to help us out here, you know? So in history, that starts to happen. And you even see like instances where even Jerome Powell's starting to like talk about even the fiscal situation. You know, they're not supposed to like comment on it. They're supposed to be independent. They're supposed to not even discuss. And you have Jerome Powell saying like the fiscal situation is unsustainable on 60 Minutes. And then on the other side, you got President Biden kind of talking about, hey, there's going to be rate cuts this year. And so you're seeing it on both sides. They're starting to knock each other. This is something that like during the 2020 pandemic, they were on the same team. They were on the same side. The Fed was easing, they were cutting, they were stimulating. The government was spending like drunken sailors. But now they're just they're not moving in the same direction. They're kind of at odds with one another in terms of the policies. And that's when you start to see independence kind of start to get eroded. And so it's an interesting time.
Yes. I actually remember during Trump's reign, how he was going pretty hardcore on Jerome Powell. Yeah. And so it is funny how they have these periods of kind of what feels like collaboration, and then periods of, bumping heads. But one wonders to what extent they are genuinely bumping heads. And it's not just about appearances, because we also know there's that sort of Washington revolving door type situation from the Treasury to the Fed, and then ultimately to go work for the investment banks and all that sort of thing. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yes,
but this was interesting because during World War II, that's when you saw Fed independence really just disappear completely. The government was like, no, you're going to do yield curve control. You're going to cap the long end so we can spend and issue all this debt. And that's when you saw debt previously like explode to these levels that we're at today. It's just really important to look at history in terms of Fed independence, when the government kind of takes the reins, especially if there's any national security issue or geopolitical issue that needs to take precedent over the Fed's mandates. That ultimately, if you're thinking about like the hierarchy of needs, if you're thinking about the Treasury, the Fed and Treasury, that kind of the tippy top that can care about price stability all they want, but if the government has to spend for a war or something like that, suddenly the government's like, no, you're not as independent as you lead people to believe. You're going to do this. And then after World War II ended, you saw Fed independence come back. There was like I forgot, in the 50s, there was some kind of accord that happened where the Fed's like, no, we need to be independent. And that kind of led to this period of them being actually independent where they're not getting told what to do anymore. But then during the Vietnam era, you start to see that eroded again, as they want to spend and spend and spend for that war. So you have these like fluctuations throughout history. And now we're in this period again where the government's knocking on the door, calling up central bankers behind the door. We don't know this is actually happening. You have to think that the fiscal situation is on the minds of these central bankers, and an interest rate level is on the mind of the Treasury officials. So
yes. And looking back in history, as you say, I mean, it's often a really interesting way to sort of put things in perspective. But, World War II, it's all about national security. You could say Vietnam, it still ultimately was, I mean, it was, I don't know, it was a proxy war with the Russians, as far as I understand. And then you try to understand today's situation where I think they've just approved How big is the package that they just approved a few days ago? Maybe even as little as
For Ukraine?
Yeah. Like I think it was 95
If I'm
billion.
remembering correctly, it was like 75 billion, but it could be more. Don't quote me
Yeah.
on that. But
Somewhere
it's
between say 70 and 90 billion. And the interesting thing is, I listened to Tucker Carlson on Joe Rogan the other day, and he was like, apparently the vast majority of the American public are just not in support of spending all this money, yet Congress, who is supposed to actually represent them, are the ones who are passing these bills to go ahead and just spend huge amounts of money on a war that doesn't appear winnable. Meanwhile, you've got all sorts of domestic issues. It just strikes me as kind of strange looking at it from it as an outsider, where everyone's clapping and waving the Ukrainian flag at passing a bill that ultimately the taxpayer has to foot the bill for, that they don't even want. It's a strange situation. I mean, what's your perception? And does it feel like Congress is out of touch with ordinary people and what they want?
Oh, absolutely. I think our elected officials forgot that they serve the constituents that elect them. It just seems like we're in this golden age of corruption where each elected official just kind of wants to kick the can down the road. They want to keep spending, get theirs, and then get out. And if you look at the average age of our congressmen, they're all older individuals. They don't think long term. I don't think they really care. They're like, well, future generations will deal with this debt problem. We'll get ours. We'll spend what we want right now to get reelected, basically. And it's a problem. And it doesn't really matter if you're red or blue. Everyone's spending. Like the conversation's not like whether or not we should spend at all. It's what they want to spend on. That's where the difference in opinion from the parties comes from, which is a problem because nobody's saying like, wait, should we be spending? It's really just arguments about we want to spend on this. We want to spend on this. And you're right. I mean, it's not surprising that the trust in institutions in the United States is at an all-time low. And, the people feel like they're not being served or not being listened to, and they're suffering. I mean, I just saw a survey, it doesn't matter the political party or the ethnicity across all demographics. It's basically from 19 to 29-year-olds. The number one problem they're facing is inflation. Number one across the board. Doesn't matter their socioeconomic status, their race, or their political affiliation. They're all suffering from inflation. And as I just mentioned, the fiscal side of the situation is what's really driving the inflation that we're seeing right now. I mean, the Fed is raising interest rates at one of the fastest paces in history. And why do we still have inflation that is lingering here? Well, there's lots of reasons, but one of the main ones is the fiscal side of things, which continues to spend basically like they're in a war or like they're in a recession. We're running recessionary deficits at a time when the economy is running above nominal GDP. It's running hot still, and at a time when an unemployment rate is at multi-decade lows. And so got to ask yourself what's going on here, because the inflation is really starting to hurt the middle and lower class in the United States. And that causes all kinds of societal issues. And so it's really confusing when you see them continue to spend, and there's no debate even about like, hey, we got to rein this in. Like we got to think about our domestic issues and the people that elect us. Because look at these surveys. They're suffering from the rising cost of living, and we're just contributing to that problem.
Yeah. But they won't recognize that. And the problem's even worse than they would admit, in the sense that the CPI doesn't actually capture the real cost of living.
Yeah, absolutely.
And given the fact that we're sitting also with, as you described, there's a lot of people, particularly young people, folks in sort of middle and low class, who feel somewhat disenchanted and kind of unhappy with the situation as it is. Do you think that we are possibly looking at the sort of fourth turning type situation where, things tend to get worse before they get better? When you think about, as a student of history and macroeconomic cycles, do you think that we are at the end of this long-term debt cycle and that we're seeing these things unfolding as fourth turning thesis sort of outlined?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some credibility to that thesis. It's certainly some of the things that they argue make up a fourth turning. That's what I feel like we're going through, which is the loss of trust in institutions, just rising geopolitical uncertainty. There's usually a large event like a war. We already went through a global pandemic in the last couple of years. During these times of a ton of polarization, and you have this huge wealth divide, That's the recipe for some kind of large societal change, like some kind of revolution, some kind of thing like that, where you actually see a big reset of what occurs. And it does seem like we're in something like that, right? And I think Bitcoin, people think Bitcoin is a way to potentially build a different system that's a little bit more fair, that's new, that's hopeful, that's optimistic, to come out of that fourth turning and build off of. And so I think Bitcoin's wrapped in that as like a function of the environment it's in, which is failing a lot of people. Like the current system is really failing a lot of people, because I would argue the current system's been basically hijacked. We live in this time of corruption and crony capitalism. And eventually people are going to say, like, enough is enough. How long can they bear this inflation? And whether inflation will kind of rise even higher as they continue to spend in the coming years, I think that's going to be a big incendiary moment, because inflation compounds and people just continue to feel it and continue to feel it. And if it doesn't come back down, if it continues to rise, all these feelings will start to bubble to the surface. And eventually people are going to figure out what's actually causing it. And so that's going to be a very interesting moment. And when people realize, wait a second, it could be the trillions and trillions of dollars they printed. Maybe that was the problem. And when that moment happens, it's going to be interesting.
Totally. I don't know if you saw that TikTok video I saw it a couple of days ago of a young girl sitting in a car and going like, everything's so expensive. Why can't they just print money? Is there any way that you can get in the ear of the government and say, hey guys, here's an idea. We just print money. And quite a few people were like, yep, that's exactly what's actually happening. Some of the thing that I think about quite often here in Australia is like something like housing has been used as a proxy for savings. And during COVID, we've seen generally property prices across the board up 40% plus over the last 4 years. So it's just that much more difficult to buy a home. Plus, we've seen rates go from, say, 2 to 5.5% to 6%. So we're sitting in this era where it's actually now, if you were just a diligent saver and you're just trying to get your deposit together, the home is now 44% more expensive. The debt's sort of at least double the price, as it were. And for a lot of people, it just feels more and more out of reach. And so, one of the chaps I engage with quite frequently online was like, he doesn't know any other way other than Bitcoin for saving for home. And I actually tend to agree. And I feel like by the time these people actually figure it out, it'll be even that much further away. I tend to be fairly pessimistic in terms of when the penny finally drops with a lot of people, that actually one of the ways that you can preserve your purchasing power is Bitcoin. I mean, what's your sort of read on that, in the sense of when do you think people finally start seeing Bitcoin? And I'm talking sort of mass market crossing into the mainstream, market and consciousness. Like, okay, hold on, this is the thing I need to save in, not these paper dollars that get inflated away each year.
Yeah, personally, I think it's something that just kind of evolves over time. Inflation or currency debasement, whatever, currency debasement is probably the more accurate term. When their money loses value, it kind of forces them eventually to kind of think about things. Like if they want to survive, they want to provide for their family, people will start to learn about other ways to protect their purchasing power, especially if the rate of currency debasement is increasing exponentially. People in other countries understand this. If they're living in a jurisdiction with high rates of currency debasement, they already know this as a culture. They get their paycheck, they immediately spend it. They'll buy anything. They'll buy like a tire just to preserve, because that'll be able to preserve value more than the currency they get paid in, and they'll be able to sell it down the road. They'll do anything. And so people start to look for other things to protect themselves. Now, Bitcoin, it's very accessible. Anybody with a phone can buy Bitcoin. Unlike a home where you have to get a mortgage, you got to get approved. It's out of reach for a lot of people. You can't buy a fraction of a home. Bitcoin is a way that's really easy to just download. You can just save in it. And then it's really what, like you're talking about, the housing affordability. I mean, there's a crisis right now for sure. I mean, it's crazy what happened, the stepwise increase in the price of homes, along with the doubling of the mortgage rates, how quickly people have been outpriced from the American dream of just owning your own home, which is really has other societal consequences of having a family, starting a family. These are like big issues.
Yeah.
And so if nobody can afford a home, they feel like they can't afford to start a family. It has long-term consequences. And when you're thinking about what can I own that will actually outpace the rate of asset price inflation or monetary inflation, so I can maybe one day afford to buy a home. Because I think everybody's goal, I mean, like, if you're not just looking at it from an investment, which you shouldn't, but like, hey, I want to own a home to have my space in this world and to have a roof over my head and to raise a family in. If I want to afford that one day, what can I save in that's actually going to outpace the rate of home prices rising, or asset price inflation, in other words, or the rate that they're printing money? And if you look at it, like, Bitcoin is probably the best way. Just look at the performance of the last 5 years. It's priced in Bitcoin.com that looks at housing prices denominated in Bitcoin over the last 5 years. It's getting cheaper for people who hold Bitcoin. And so it's really important that people find ways. There's other assets they can go to as well that perform well in high inflationary environments. I just personally believe that Bitcoin offers an asymmetric upside because it's so small still. You have this benefit of its growing adoption, and then it's so scarce. It's the only like fixed supply asset that could potentially go up magnitudes when you're denominated against housing, obviously dollars, or really any other asset. So yeah, I mean, I think people will just kind of find it because they'll have to find it, because if they don't, they're going to suffer. And then the last thing I'll say is, just as other people hold Bitcoin that they know, and their life is getting easier and better, that's more motivating than anything. When your neighbor is, being able to afford that car or that lake house, and he's like, well, I'm saving in Bitcoin. What are you saving in?
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm saving in dollars, and everything seems to be getting more expensive. And so that is very motivating, but that takes time. Like, it's going to take time, like over 10 years, to see that, and to see the difference in people's quality of life who save in a money that can't be debased versus those who save in a money that can be debased. And to see that kind of like realization as people look at their other friends and family members who are thriving, as they're really drowning in currency debasement.
Yes. And not only drowning in currency debasement, they're also drowning in a sense of like nihilism. There's a strange correlation between being obsessed by Bitcoin and optimism. But something you said there struck me, and I think this is completely accurate. There are parts of the world that already understand that fiat is a giant melting ice cube and have taken steps appropriately. And you don't have to be, a finance major to understand that. As you say, there's parts of the world where it's literally money in, money out. Like, get rid of this. This stuff is just like, it's on fire. It's losing value. And then I'll store in something like the US dollar. Perhaps, it's fair to say that in countries like the US and Australia, they feel there's a problem, but they don't feel the problem of currency debasement as acutely. And so they will, unfortunately, be some of the last folks to actually realize that, hey, saving Bitcoin is the answer. Whereas you don't have to persuade a Zimbabwean or an Argentinian or Venezuelan, because it's pretty self-evident when the guys have to keep changing the prices at the supermarket every single day because the currency is just all over the show. I think that's pretty much as clear as day for anybody.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a risky asset for those people, right? Yeah, Bitcoin can be volatile, but it's for the people that are suffering from triple-digit inflation, annual inflation rates. It's a risk-off asset for them, right? With increased capital controls. And it just reminded me of this like IMF study that recently came out on Bitcoin, where they they found that in the data, basically, in jurisdictions that have more instability or macroeconomic imbalances, as they say, there's higher rates of Bitcoin flows, both off-chain and on-chain, indicating that people turn to Bitcoin as almost like a safe haven asset in those regions. So, I mean, it's exactly right. I mean, you don't have to explain it to those people because they understand. They're like, oh, it's scarce. Oh, they can't print it. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Whereas like an American, we haven't experienced really any rate of inflation since the 1970s. It's just not in our culture. We haven't suffered like that. And so it is going to take time for them to wrap their heads around it. And unfortunately, those other cultures are more prepared. They understand like why shortages could happen. They're more self-sufficient. They don't rely on the government. They they learned how to grow food and have chickens and, like I said, ditch their currencies and acquire hard assets. And so it's going to take time, I think, for Americans to basically react to what's unfolding. But some people are well aware, and they are moving to harder assets, and a lot of the wealthy are. You just see a lot of these people acquiring hard assets, real estate. They're preparing. They know what's coming, and I think that's why Bitcoiners are so adamant to kind of educate people on it, so that they too can protect themselves. Even if it's not with Bitcoin, it could be other assets, but you got to ditch cash and you got to ditch probably bonds in a highly inflationary, secular inflationary decade. It's just, you're going to lose in real terms.
100%. And you have to just get that time in the market. We actually were having some drinks with friends last night, and one of the girls was saying she's sitting on some cash that she's been stashing away for the last 3 years. And her accountant has said, no, keep it in an offset account, which is effectively an account that sits alongside your mortgage. And the more cash you have in that mortgage, in that offset account, you'd only pay the difference between your offset and the actual amount that you borrowed. And so you're going, well, think of the money you're saving on your interest payments. And I was like, Bitcoin, just think about getting something. Because to be honest with you, like, yes, that's fine. I mean, it's nice that you're saying, that you could save a little bit of interest, but you've got to go and actually speculate. I mean, that's effectively what we do. We can't just save our money. We have to speculate. And so you decide how far on the risk curve you want to go, but sitting in cash is just a terrible idea. So get in, come on, stop mucking around, which actually reminds me of something I wanted to ask you, actually, Sam. You mentioned sort of high net worths, and those type of folks they can see the situation, they can see the persistent inflation, they want to preserve their purchasing power, and at least a portion of their investments are going to these scarce, unprintable assets like farmland or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the conversations you guys are having or that you're hearing within Swan. Obviously, post ETF now, I'd love to get sort of, what it's like on the inside, the conversations you guys have had, particularly now. You've also got the institutional side of things. I'd love to just get a kind of sense of, what are the conversations internally, particularly now that we've seen these ETFs come to market.
Yeah, the ETFs definitely gave a little bit of like regulatory clarity, I guess is the word, for some of these like money managers or high net worth individuals who feel like, okay, like if the SEC just gave us a green light and we have BlackRocks of the world and Fidelities of the world, pushing Bitcoin content and educational materials, I think it's ready for prime time, or so to speak, or it's not going anywhere. And so the conversations are more about, they're not like they were a few years ago where it's like, this is a bubble, this is going away. It's more about like, how do I play this? What's the position size? What's appropriate? Or, what's the difference between ETF and self-custody? So understanding that with an ETF, I mean, you're basically taking on counterparty risk. There's an annual fee attached to it. You're trusting somebody else to hold those keys. There's less in terms of capital efficiency. So like with Bitcoin, you can actually use it for things when you hold a real asset. And so, yeah, I mean, that's kind of where the conversations are going. And then it's like, how do you secure it appropriately? We just launched Swan Vault, which is our multi-sig products, teaching them the differences between single sig, multi-sig, how to appropriately secure it. When Bitcoin performs as it has over the last year, I think it's up almost like 140% or so. Again, it's the best performing asset in 2023 after it once again like died in 2022, right?
Yeah.
And so it's back. So people are like, oh man, maybe I have to reevaluate my previous notions. That's why I love bull markets, because then you have people like, whoa, this thing's back, I must have been wrong. And so then they start doing the work. Now the bear market does a good job of like doing that for us, because I think people start to understand like, oh, there's Bitcoin, there's everything else. But that is a conversation we have frequently with people. And yeah, so the interest is there. It's exciting. I mean, a lot more like institutional investors are seeing this as a way to diversify their portfolio, which is what I mentioned. You mentioned people going into farmland. It's really like alternative assets as a way to diversify bonds and stocks, because that's traditionally when you create a portfolio, those two move differently in periods of economic downturns. And that's been like the basis of modern portfolio theory over the last 20, 30 years. When things fall down, the stock market goes down, they cut rates, so bond prices go up. and it can provide that buffer for the overall portfolio. That's why you have a, portfolio of bonds and stocks.
Yeah.
But the problem is during inflationary periods, the correlation breaks down and becomes positive. And so you have bonds and stocks falling together. And that's what you had in 2022 when bonds got massacred and the stock market went down. And that scared money managers like crazy because like when both of those things go down, there's no hedging going on there. There's no diversification. And so that's why you have to find alternative assets that perform well in inflationary environments, that provide that diversification, that just move differently. And so people look to gold, people look to, real estate, like you said, farmland. Those are all like under the umbrella of alternative assets. And you could put Bitcoin in there, obviously. And so Bitcoin, when you add even a small amount to a portfolio, like a 1%, 2% allocation, they're like, even if we buy a little bit and say the crazy thing happens, it goes to zero, we're only going to lose like 1%. We can manage that. But if Bitcoin continues to perform like it does and it moves differently from the rest of our portfolio, that 1% can make a really meaningful difference in our overall risk-adjusted returns. And so that's powerful. And that's what basically all money managers look for. A joke is that like, if you went to one of these, then you just explained Bitcoin, but you didn't use the word Bitcoin. You said, hey, I got this hedge fund that's been performing like this. If you include it in the portfolio, do you want to buy it? And you show the historical returns, they'll be like, oh yeah, that sounds really interesting. And there's no fees. Oh, wow, that's really cool. But then you're like, well, that's Bitcoin. And they're like, oh, really? Because there's so much preconceived notions about it and so much misinformation about it that if you just remove the word Bitcoin, sometimes people are like, oh, just look at the data, look at the returns, look at the performance. Then that kind of wakes people up. That's kind of the discussions we're having at Swan.
I think what you're referring to there in terms of the small sliver in your portfolio is reference to the Makamoto portfolio tool that you guys have. Yeah. And I have directed folks there in the past and just said, like, look, you do not need to go all in on this thing. Even a small allocation over a long period of time can have a meaningful impact. And, worst case, this thing goes to zero. And you know what your losses are going to be, whether it's 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever you're deciding to allocate. But the upside is, unknown. It's potentially infinite. So, and that's the absolute beauty of it. I suppose what's really interesting in that sort of 60-40 split that you're referring to there is, and I hadn't thought about this before you actually mentioned it, but part of that is like the idea that you want to kind of smooth out volatility. And from my perspective, I'm going like, I don't care about volatility because I've got a long time horizon. I'm not looking to draw down on this capital in 5, 10, or even 20 years' time, perhaps. I think when we're thinking about this sort of modern portfolio theory where we're going, hey, we need inversely correlated assets so that we have a quote unquote all-weather portfolio, like a Ray Dalio type style thing. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's like, it becomes somewhat obsolete, in the minds of Bitcoiners because we're kind of like, yeah, well, I don't care if it's going up or down or sideways, but over the long run, it's pretty clear where it's going. So it seems like the game should be to increase your units of fiat currency by investing, not to have the smoothest ride on the way up. I don't particularly care about that. What do you think about that sort of idea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just goes down to like risk tolerance and risk reward because that only works if you hold through the volatility, right? And some people get shaken out and that takes conviction. If somebody's like all in at 100%, and maybe they didn't do the homework, so they don't know exactly what they own, and they see their net worth on paper go down 70%. The risk is that they sell the bottom, and then they miss out on all the gains, right? But if somebody did a proper position size, and it's less, it's like 20%, but they were able to hold through all that volatility because it was a proper position for their risk tolerance, then they're going to benefit because, like what you said, it's all about time in the market. And you can't be on the sideline when Bitcoin does those rips upwards or else you'll drastically underperform. You can't be on the sidelines because you never know when those days are going to happen. And so it's always like, yes, I agree with what you're saying. And even if, I say 1%, 2%, 5%, but actually when you run the data, the more Bitcoin you have, the better the risk adjusted returns of the portfolio is, whether you can manage it with your own personal risk tolerance and your own personal financial goals. Even BlackRock came out and recently said like, well, we ran the models and there's like some analysts that said like, well, technically it's like a 25, 27% allocation is the
Yes.
ideal allocation. And then I remember there was even a paper years ago from BlackRock that said, well, technically like an 84% portfolio allocation would be good, which is
Yeah.
crazy when you think about like a, institutional investor managing God knows how much money, or like a really high net worth individual. But like, it's when you look at the data, if you just like follow that, yeah, I mean, it's not as crazy. But then, if you're a Bitcoiner, you understand what you own. And once you really understand it, there's that chart of like, the more you understand Bitcoin, the higher percentage of your net worth you hold in it, because you learn that you're like, nothing else has this kind of asymmetric opportunity. And especially if you're trying to build wealth as a young person, you probably have a higher risk tolerance because you have more years to make that money back if you're wrong. If you're in retirement, you're worried your risk tolerance typically goes down because you don't want to lose your nest egg, because you can't get it back because you can't work to gain it back because you're just too old. So like younger people with a longer time horizon who see this thing, this asymmetric opportunity, and they're trying to build wealth. And you don't build wealth by diversifying. You build wealth by making concentrated bets with high conviction. You diversify when you want to protect that wealth once you've gained it. And so as a young person, it makes a lot of sense to have a more concentrated portfolio in general. And then I just don't see anything else on the market personally that has the asymmetric profile of Bitcoin. And like, none of this is financial advice. This is just like, I'm just looking at myself and it's hard for me to see another opportunity like Bitcoin, given its, recent performance, but also just how small it is. There's companies that are bigger than Bitcoin right now, and the total addressable market that Bitcoin can eat as like a money itself, as a store of value, it's enormous. And so the potential there to be multiple hires, I think, is extremely attractive if you're a young person with a very, very long time horizon. So you'll benefit from Bitcoin's price appreciation as its adoption increases. So
Yeah.
yeah.
100% agree there. And I think the key there is ultimately your position size should reflect your conviction, which should be a reflection of the work you've done. So if you've only done a small amount of work, you're not going to be able to withstand the volatility. But if you presumably have gone deep down the rabbit hole and you look, and on a risk adjusted basis, there probably isn't a better opportunity. It's likely that there will be a stock that will outperform Bitcoin, like an individual stock. But how many of us are going to have that ability to be able to pick that individual stock and the risk that is associated with that? Whereas Bitcoin, as the sort of sole digital money, there's no second best. It's already established that kind of competitive moats, like a Google would in the world of search engine and all that sort of thing. So you think that today it is far less risky than it was 4 years ago when I first started involved. And funnily enough, like, it's not just on a risk adjusted basis. When you look at the fact now there's this regulatory clarity, as you say, it is just so compelling. And yeah, I think for most of us, we're already kind of pretty heavily exposed, but I just wonder when the average person just starts allocating meaningfully, because at these current prices, we're still going to see a lot of upside because the total addressable market is huge. And we're still very early, as we tend to say. But there is something about the returns, from my perspective, are necessarily going to be, I think, over time, diminished relative to the past. I mean, if you think of 2013 to 2017, 17 to 21, I believe in the diminishing returns sort of side of things. I don't know. What is your perspective on that? Do you subscribe to that, or do you reckon because the institutions are here and potentially we've got nation states coming, that sort of model will be broken?
Yeah, I understand the diminishing returns theory as Bitcoin's market cap increases, and it's kind of like that trend. But I do think so much untapped potential is there for us to get this like exponential curve upwards. So that could break one cycle, and then there's like diminishing returns after. It reminds me of like the network effect, that chart of exponential growth of networks when you cross that chasm from like early adopters to the early mainstream, any kind of new technology. And I don't think we've gone there yet. I think there could be a substantial more amount of users on the Bitcoin network or just holding Bitcoin that could kind of break that diminishing return cycle. And the ETFs and sovereign wealth funds, nation states, all of this is like factored in. And we've only scratched the surface about all that capital getting into Bitcoin. And so, yeah, I don't know if I really subscribe to that. I think we will have this cycle that kind of breaks the diminishing returns. And then after that, there might be like diminishing returns from later cycles. But I just think we have that stepward function and adoption that's still ahead of us.
Yeah.
And it might not feel that way for some people, but I do think we're still really early in terms of just general Bitcoin adoption. And you brought up like, when are like retail investors going to come in? And in this bull cycle, I do think that there are cycles. I think we're still early in this bull cycle. We just crossed the last all-time high, and now we're kind of consolidating around it. So that's pretty typical and kind of grab some attention. But until we kind of like really clear that all-time high with conviction, with momentum, retail investors, unfortunately, they buy tops of cycles, right? So I think once they're like really gets going and Bitcoin has really started ripping over the next like 18 months or so, I think that's when you'll see retail investors start to come in, because they never buy the bottoms. Whenever it's like down 70% when they should be buying, they're not interested, right? It's when it's already up like 200-300%, that's when they all like YOLO in. And that's what makes the cycle top. Like by definition is you have a bunch of people coming in at the very end, and you get this like kind of blow off top at the end of the cycle. And then since they don't know what they're buying, they're just kind of FOMOing in because everyone else is getting wealthy that they see buying it. Then when it crashes back down a little bit, they all sell because they don't know what they're holding. So that's like how I think about these like cycle tops. And so, but I don't think we've seen that. Like, I think we're still early in this bull market cycle, which means I think there is like room to go here. And I think the ETFs are a part of it. I think, we will start to see more institutional adoption. I think we've barely seen like RIAs or asset managers really make meaningful moves into this space yet. But the education is coming full force, and now it's the most credible, largest institutions in the world educating them on it. And that's big. I mean, you can be critical of these institutions, but in that world of big money, of Wall Street money, name recognition matters and credibility matters, unfortunately. So when they see the BlackRock logo recommending some of these things, that's all it really takes for them, So be patient. There will be big drawdowns in bull markets. Like there's that chart of like 20% drawdowns, like 6 or 7 times in the last cycle. So just totally normal price behavior, but be patient, think long term, think multiple cycles when you hold Bitcoin, and just know what you own.
Yeah, exactly. Know what you own and why you own it. We're sort of consolidating at these levels of retail hasn't arrived. Actually seems to be reflected in some of the on-chain data. And unfortunately, retail folks tend to only buy the tops, and those are the signals. I remember I said this on a past episode. My brother-in-law's granny wanted to buy Bitcoin, and that was, I think, sort of around March 21. So I'm gonna use that as my sort of measure of when we reach the top, because
those are useful. Yeah,
you get those
totally. Text messages. I got one friend too. Yeah, I got one friend who did that.
Yeah,
he's like, man, I should have bought at 17. Do you think think it's too late?
Oh,
and I'm like, that turned out to be like 74K.
Here we go. It just is the way it is, and then that sort of brand recognition, I think you say there, is really critical. I mean, I saw something out there that and this was yesterday, where IBIT, BlackRock's ETF, has sort of crossed into the top 10 ETFs of all time in terms of consecutive days of inflows. So I think we've got over 70 days of consecutive inflows. And that really matters. And even to somebody who's sort of a kind of Bitcoin denier, as it were, or naysayer, I think that's just kind of undeniable evidence. And to your point, we haven't even begun tapping the sort of RIA market yet. $30 trillion in managed money sitting there. So there's so much upside. I'm known as the resident bear in Bitcoin circles here because, I don't know, I felt particularly stung by the last cycle. Maybe it's because I'm relatively green. I haven't gone through multiple, but I've just sort of decided that I'm pretty comfortable with 20-30% compounded growth over the next decade. But my hope is, of course, for much more than that. Sam, I wanted to sort of ask a couple other sort of quick questions in rounding out today. Your most controversial view in Bitcoin, what is that? I always like to sort of See, because I think one of the things we're guilty of sometimes is this groupthink. And I just find myself sometimes when we're all being herded into having the quote unquote correct opinion, I tend to kind of just reflexively reject that, perhaps because I'm just disagreeable by nature. My personal view is like, like with the node, I don't think it's that necessary to run a node. I kind of said that now. And some people don't like it, but yeah, that's my controversial view. What is your controversial view that you perhaps have in the space?
I'll give you two. One is that I think like by holding Bitcoin as a store of value, you are using Bitcoin. I think that's the killer use case, its ability to store value over the long term. And that is a big solution to a big problem right now, which is fiat currency debasement. Like nobody can save. And I think if Bitcoin never reaches its full potential as a digital cash medium of exchange, for whatever reason, which I don't necessarily believe this, but if it just was a store of value, it would still be incredibly valuable to the world. I believe that it's going to scale in layers and it's going to be the foundation. I do believe that's how things will play out. It'll be the foundation and it'll be like the settlement network and there'll be different levels of privacy and, functionality and speed above it in layers. That's my belief long term. But if that doesn't play out for whatever reason, and we just have this hard digital money that can be a store of value, it'll still be incredibly valuable for the world. And so that's probably one. And then the other one is just like with custody. I think people can get way too cute with self-custody in terms of like, hey, I want a multi-sig of like 3 of 5 and, more the better. You can complicate it and like have all these different keys and put them everywhere. More is not better. You have to know what you're doing and people can mess it up. And so just to keep it simple, I kind of did this myself. I had 3 of 5 and then like I actually simplified it to 2 of 3 because it was like, I just don't want to deal with all these different hardware wallets and all these different things. And I think that's just an important, people have to like think about their security and then keep it simple so that they don't mess it up because it's the people that mess it up more than anything. And the last thing you want to do is lose control of your keys and then just like watch Bitcoin be adopted by the entire world the rest of your life. Like that should be your number one goal. Don't lose my Bitcoin so that I don't have to watch it dominate all the rest of my life and watch the price continue to go up and think, man, I should have just kept it simple. Maybe that's not controversial, but I don't know. Just security is so important and just keep it simple to your own, whatever works for you, just so that you're holding onto your keys and you don't lose them. That's number one.
Yeah, I can sort of empathize with both of those controversial takes. I don't think they're that controversial, actually. I think the interesting part, though, with the security and custody piece is like a single sig. Yes, it's a single point of failure, but that actually is good enough for, I think, the vast majority of people. And the more cute you try to get, the greater the risk that you're going to get in your own way. I don't actually know what I would do with myself, knowing that I've got a material portion of my wealth tied up in Bitcoin. If I wreck this, like, I don't know what I'd do. I'd cry for days. I'd be angry. I'd have to go to all sorts of therapy. And I don't know how I'd ever be able to recover. Like realistically, you kind of go like, this would be like, it would be the biggest blunder of my entire life. And I'd feel completely wrecked because I would have ruined not only my financial future, but that of my children. No, I've got to do this. I'm going to be smart. But I think, to your point, like I've also gone through that journey. You go down the rabbit hole and then you're like, well, how do they generate those 12 words? Okay, I've got to roll my own. Okay, cool. How do I trust cold cards entropy? No, I've got to go and like physically pick all the
roll some dice.
Yeah, to roll some dice. And like I've just gone further and further. I'm like, yeah, it's cool to learn about that. But at the same time, like it's for the vast majority of people, like, what does Greg Foss say? Like, you're too smart by half. Like, don't try to be too cute, yeah.
I've heard so many people just like forget things, forget where they put it. So they just got too cute.
Yeah.
And then I just remember this guy it was like some post. This had to be like in 2017, but like I felt so bad for him because he had lost like thousands of Bitcoin early on. And then he rebuilt his stack in like 2015, 2016 to like hundreds of Bitcoin or like 100 Bitcoin or something like that. And then 2027 happened and it got up to like 20,000. And he had it on some kind of hardware wallet and he had it in a drawer. And then his girlfriend mistook it for like a car key and an old car key and threw it out. And he lost his stack. and he basically wrote this post being like, I don't even know what to say. Like I'm done. Like, please just learn from my mistakes. And I was like, my main goal is just to not end up like that. I hope he's doing all right. It's just like such a crushing. Those are the worst stories in Bitcoin, in my opinion. They're just crushing to hear about.
That is heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. That's a double whammy, and that's just, oh my God. Like, yeah, there was also, I remember I did some time in the crypto media world, and there was also the story of a guy, James Howells, I think his name is, where he had hundreds of thousands, maybe like, did he have 100,000 or I don't know. I mean, it was a large number on a hard drive. And he had two different hard drives. One had all the Bitcoin, one didn't. And he went and he chucked it and it went into this dump. And he's been fighting with the dump to try and get access to
that guy. He always comes up in bull markets. Like
the poor guy.
Story, every bull market you hear about. And then like some of these critics use it. They're like, see, this is why, Bitcoin's risky. You can lose it in a dump.
Totally. And
I was like, no, just keep it simple.
He worked with some VC funds to use robotic dogs to sort rubbish so that they could try and find these parts, but it hasn't worked out well for him. So, all right, TLDR, keep it simple, stupid. Yeah. Awesome, Sam. This has been really great. And yeah, big fan of what you guys are doing at Swan. Also big fan of your work and your partner, Natalie. It's awesome. The power couple in Bitcoin. You guys are rocking it. Did you have any sort of parting words or where you want to sort of send listeners or people who are watching?
Thanks for having me and appreciate what you're doing with the podcast. You can find some of my work on the Swan Signal blog. We just actually posted like our kind of a beginner mining report. If you're interested in learning more about Bitcoin mining from a more like high level perspective about the different players in the space, kind of the different narratives that are playing out or how they're innovating. It's a good report if you're just trying to learn about Bitcoin mining for the first time. And so we just released that, so you can check that out. And then I host Swan Signal, so you can check out that podcast on the Swan YouTube channel. And then I'm on Twitter or X at Sam Callahan, SamCallah. And I'm always posting my thoughts and analysis there. So give me a follow there. Yeah, appreciate it.
Awesome, man. All right, well, have a superb rest of your day and hope to meet in person one day.
You too. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that you got some value out of it. Either way, hit me up on Twitter and let me know what you think. My handle is Dale21M. If you've got any suggestions as to people you think I should be talking to or topics I should address too, I would love that sort of feedback. Otherwise, if you want to support the show, there's a couple different ways you can do that. The first is just to share it amongst your friends and family. The more that people hear the message that Bitcoin and crypto are not the same thing, the better. And I want to help people understand that. The second thing you can do is give me a 5-star review on whichever podcast app you're using. Of course, that's only if I deserve it. And last but not least, if you want to stream sats my way via the Fountain app, I'm not going to say no, but it's not expected. Thank you so much for your support thus far. It means the world to me. I appreciate the hell out of you, and the best is yet to come. Much love, friends. I'll see you on the other side.